and thank you so much for being here. My name is Steve Ralston, and I teach in the Spanish department here at the university. And it is a tremendous pleasure, although probably a superfluous one, to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Antonio Momplet. He is a professor and a former chairman of the Department of Medieval Art History at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid. And he started his career as an expert in the architecture of 11th and 12th century Christian Spain, and has published on, especially on Romanesque architecture connected with the Camino de Santiago. But his reputation rests more these days, I think, on his research and publications on the art of Islamic Spain during a much broader period that spans the 8th to the 15th century. Antonio came to Sewanee, I think, for the first time in 1989 as a Fulbright Fellow. And he has returned approximately one semester every 3 years since then. So most of you know him from his multiple visits to the campus. I can't really think of an individual who's not a permanent member of the faculty who has served and loved and worked for the benefit of this university as much as Antonio has. We see him on campus once every 3 years if we're lucky. But those of us who work in the study abroad programs at the Spanish department see him every year and every summer. He is a co-founder of both of our study abroad programs and teaches courses and organizes things for us along with his wife, Rocío, every year. So he is a constant presence and an element who has changed the lives of many generations of Sewanee students. The title of Antonio's talk today is The Art of Islamic Spain Beyond the Middle Ages and Beyond the Iberian Peninsula.
First of all, I would like to express my thanks to the college for inviting me to give this talk. Definitely to the Spanish department and particularly to Professor Ralston that has been so kind and so untruthful in his presentation. and also to the Sewanee Archives and Special Collections that has allowed us to take advantage of this light reading room. That I think it's a very nice and cozy place for this kind of events. And thank you to you all for being here. And I hope you will be also as glad at the end as you are to be now. This is a view of central Seville, with the great Gothic cathedral in the middle. Seville was, no question, one of the most important cities of Islamic Spain, second only at some times to Cordoba. And this is the Country Club Plaza in Kansas City. Probably all of you will be asking yourselves, what do they have in common? Why they are both here? Well, they share something very particular in common. That's because Sevilla, the cathedral, actually still keeps the original late 12th century minaret that belonged to the previous great Almohad Mosque. When they demolished the mosque in the 15th century to build a new Gothic cathedral, they took advantage of largely the main part, the lower part of the Islamic tower, and completed it with a body of bell body at the top. Well, it is known as La Giralda. It's a very peculiar name that refers to the statue that's at the top. That's a weather vane representing the faith, and as it turns around with the wind, the verb turn around, for those of you who are familiar with Spanish, is girar, so they called it, the civilians, el giraldillo. And finally, the whole tower was named after this weather vane. But that's relatively unimportant. but it is one of the major, most recognizable Islamic monuments in Spain, definitely the most famous of Sevilla. And this is the same tower, not really the same tower, but it's the tower that was built in the 1960s in Kansas City, and imitating, just following step by step. It's only 2/3 of the actual size of the civilian tower. Now, why did they build this? Well, and where? Now, this place was a project of J.C. Nichols, that was a real estate promoter who actually had traveled to Spain and started building this. Well, it's actually a shopping mall, apparently one of the first in the history of the United States with those characteristics. And he started including in his project elements that will be reminders of the Spain he had known or something connected. It was after his death that his continuators did build the tower. And it was part of sistering the two cities. The two cities, Kansas City and Seville, came to be sister cities. Actually the mayor of Sevilla went to Kansas City to the inauguration and so forth. And as part of those, let's say, exchanges between the two sister cities, Kansas City got its Giralda. And we in Seville got this statue of a Cherokee Indian that was placed in the main avenue that leads to the center of Sevilla when you come from the capital, for example, from Madrid. That's called Kansas City Avenue. Okay. All this talk has to do with these influences that beyond the Middle Ages and beyond the Iberian Peninsula, you can find of Islamic Spain, especially of the most important, the most recognizable Spanish Islamic monuments. Where are they located? Well, basically, in the three cities you have there, and that map of Al-Andalus, approximately in the 10th century, that are Seville, Córdoba, and Granada. That were the Seville and Córdoba, no question, two most important cities in the history of Al-Andalus, and Granada, very important because it was the capital of the last territory that was Islamic territory from the mid-13th to until 1492 in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, if we focus on the main monuments that we keep in these cities, that are the major monuments of Islamic Spanish architecture, besides the Giralda Tower, and we'll go back to it at the end of the talk, we have to focus, first of all, in Córdoba, in the Great Mosque of Córdoba. Now, one of the problems we do have, for example, with religious Islamic architecture in Spain is its preservation. A lot of what were the great mosques that existed in medieval Spain, thousands, have disappeared. In part because of ideological facts, in part just for practical purposes. When they reconquered the Christian these towns and these cities, they used some of the mosques as churches, but they weren't fit. Architecturally speaking, the space wasn't fit for the ceremonies, the rituals of Christian church. And therefore, they went replacing them the moment they had the resources to do it. This didn't happen in the Mosque of Córdoba due to a very, special, even surprising event. The Bishop of Córdoba and the Council of the Cathedral in the early 16th century decided to do the same thing that they had done in Sevilla the century before, demolish the mosque and build a proper cathedral. But the council of the city, the civil council of the city opposed. From our view of the 21st century, that makes lots of sense, but we're talking about the 1520s. But probably there was something connected with our understanding of what our patrimony, historical patrimony is. They believed probably that was an icon of the city, something that was giving the idea of the personality, a symbol for the city. So finally the issue, the struggle between the civil and the religious power reached the king, and the king decided in a Solomonic way, build the cathedral without destroying the mosque. I understand that the great architect that was responsible of the building at that time, called Hernan Ruiz, a very talented fellow, probably had to be well kept in an asylum for a couple of months when he was told what he had to do because the king had decided that. But finally he did very well, and that kind of mushroom that you see here appearing in the middle of the mosque is the 16th, 17th century cathedral that he actually built, taking advantage of the old building and without really demolishing it. Now, the original building is one of the most fabulous buildings in the history of architecture. Or that's at least my belief, for several reasons. The most distinctive of its features are the archways and how they are designed. And the anonymous architect that did it was obviously an extremely talented man who blended all together all his knowledge about architecture. Probably we can read through it part of what his life had been. He knew about Roman architecture, Byzantine architecture, Islamic architecture of Syria, and Visigothic, local Spanish Visigothic architecture. And he took advantage of all those ideas to create this structure, in most cases solving problems. For example, all the columns in their capitals are Roman and Visigothic, older spolia. He didn't have the workshops or the artists to create, to manufacture those approximately 150 columns. But he had lots of those elements that belong to previous buildings, Roman and Visigothic, of the area, including the church, that St. Vincent Church, that was in this very same place, and that it had to be demolished to build this first mosque in the late 8th century. And part of the design is extremely intelligent, because he had to solve a problem that they didn't have in previous large mosques in the Near East or in Northern Africa. That would be more or less the references. And that's that in Cordoba, in southern Spain, it doesn't rain a lot, but when it rains, it pours. And that's what you can see in this photograph. So every one of the archways was designed to have a canal at the top to actually be able to get the water, the rainwater, out at both ends. So the whole archway actually works as an aqueduct. Each archway is based in the idea of Roman aqueduct, such as this one that it's not far from Cordoba in the city of Merida. But the most special of all the extensions that were made along the 9th and 10th century of the mosque took place in the 10th century under the kingdom, the reign of Caliph Al-Hakam II, between 961 and 971. Among the features, the extraordinary features, originals, that were included in this part of the mosque, we have the earliest, the first examples of this type of vaults, such as the one that's right in front of the mihrab, that are called caliphal rib vaults because of those designed with ribs, but that are absolutely original have nothing to do with the Gothic rib vaults, that are absolutely original from this moment. The earliest we do keep are these. There are 4 in the Mosque of Cordoba. Probably they were inspired by Byzantine buildings that have disappeared. And we know that Byzantine decorators and builders were working at Cordoba at this time. But nevertheless, they are the models, the originals, that are going to have an enormous impact afterwards, not only in Islamic Spain or in Islamic architecture of Northern Africa, what makes lots of sense, but also in Christian architecture. And we have examples starting by Romanesque in Spain. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Navarra, in Torres del Rio, as a matter of fact, right in the way of St. James, at the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage road, and that's the whole interior, one of these caliphal ribbed vault inspiration that was adapted here. We have them in southern France, such as this one in the transept of the Church of Sainte-Marie-aux-Laurents, also about 1200, late 12th century. We do have them in Gothic architecture, of course, and this is also inspired in caliphal ribbed vaults. It's Aragonese Cathedral of Zaragoza. And further away, and in time and in space, we do have them in Italy, for example, as the one that Guarino Guarini built at the Church of San Lorenzo, St. Lawrence, in Torino. That is exactly, directly inspired in the caliphal Spanish ribbed vaults. But the one that actually attracted my attention for longer was the caliphal ribbed vault that was built in the second half of the 14th century in the kitchen, the original kitchen of the priory at Durham Cathedral. At a certain point, a few years ago, I decided to deepen a little bit more in my understanding of this building and the vault that was actually built by an architect called John Levin between 1368 and 1374. And here you see it's exactly that same type of design. In researching and reading about this architect and this building, I found out that he was also responsible of part of the building, about 20 miles away from Durham, of Raby Castle, that belonged to one of the big important noble families of northern England, the Nevilles. And looking at the plan of the castle, I found out that the kitchen of the castle, pointed there with an arrow, had something in the drawing that actually could look like one of these designs of caliphal ribbed vaults. I couldn't get any photograph from anywhere of this place. So I decided to travel to England. And it was one of the most entertaining and wonderful experiences of my life as a researcher, a professor. Finally I was able to see directly. I had seen it like 40 years ago, Durham's Cathedral, all of it, and the kitchen particularly. But finally I could go to Raby Castle. It wasn't open to the public. The curator there was a very, very, very kind woman that actually, we had an appointment and they showed me the castle all over. Beautiful, by the way, splendid collections of art. And finally I got to the kitchen. That's the kitchen, the old kitchen. That's part of the visit. It's not in use. With a caliphal ribbed vault. Now, how can you explain that this John Levin, this architect, was able to know and to build caliphal ribbed vaults in some of the buildings he accomplished in northern England in the 1360s, 1370s? The explanation is this guy. This was one of the important clients of John Levin. He, amongst other representatives of the English nobility of the time, he worked for the Duke of Lancaster. Duke of Lancaster was the second son of Edward III. Now, Edward III had an alliance with the King of Castile and Leon, that was Peter I at that time, that was struggling for the power with his half-brother, Henry II. In 1367, an English army under the command of the Duke of Lancaster and the Black Prince, his elder brother, was put together to help Peter I to fight back. He had been deprived of the throne, fight back his brother. They all went to southern France, where they got together with the Spanish Castilian Peter I army, and they fought, and actually they defeated his brother and took the throne back just for a couple of years, because in 1369 Peter I was going to be murdered by his brother personally. So the thing ended after that. But at this time there was a whole British army with everything that includes a British army, including engineers, builders, etc., etc., under the command of the Duke of Lancaster. Well, it could have happened, we don't know. I don't have the fact, the document, that John Lewin could have been one of those builders serving in the Duke of Lancaster's army. But if it wasn't that the reason why he knew the Caliphate revolts as models, the other one was that the Duke of Lancaster married the eldest daughter of Peter I, Constanza. When the king died, was murdered, he claimed his rights, the Duke of Lancaster, as a legitimate king of Castile. And as a matter of fact, he created a parallel court to the one of Henry II in Castile, in England, that, well, kept on going with lots of Spaniards, those loyal to Peter I and to his daughter, around him. It is pretty sure that among the retinue of people that were there were lots of people that knew about this type of architecture. Seville was the major town where, Andalusia in general, the major place where the King Peter and his nobility and his family did live most of the time. So they were very aware of this architecture that surrounded them in Andalusia. If John Lewin was not in the campaign in Spain the 2 years before, he sure must have known some of these people in England when he was working for the Duke of Lancaster himself, and from there he probably got the ideas for building these, well, surprising walls, considering that they are so far away from its original source in Spain. If we have to talk about the great Spanish influential monuments of Islamic architecture, the other one besides the Mosque of Córdoba would be the Alhambra Palace in Granada, built during the last period of that dominion of Muslims in southern Spain between the mid-13th and the mid-15th century. At the time when the end that we're attending historically to the end of Islamic Spain, and where obviously the resources of the kings of Granada, the sultans of Granada, were not as fabulous as it had been in previous centuries, such as when these extensions of the Mosque of Córdoba were done. But nevertheless, they had the heritage, the tradition, the knowledge that they have inherited from the previous centuries of Islamic Spanish history. And they were able to build this incredible Palatine city palace. As a matter of fact, it has been very, I think, correctly described as the swan song of Islamic Spain. Because although it wasn't built with the noble, exquisite, expensive materials as the Mosque of Córdoba or other previous palaces, it looks as beautiful, as elegant, as, well, impacting as one can imagine. It includes everything that we understand as characteristic of Islamic architecture in general, and Spanish Islamic architecture in particular. The presence of the gardens is something, and the water is something constant. It refers to the origins of Islam, the desert of Arabia, where water and vegetation, the oasis is what is more valuable. And that is going to be something that from those historical and ethnic and geographical origins is always going to be present in the minds of the Muslims, no matter where they are going to be living, most of the times away from any desertic context. In some cases, even in the Alhambra of Granada, that reaches, moments of exquisite refinement, as in the water staircase that is at the very far end, at the top of the city palace. There, the water, sometimes you don't see it, but you always listen to it, especially because it goes down the canals on the laterals, and you're surrounded by the flowing of the water. And in those canals, you can still see, if you watch closely, the original 14th century green ceramic tiles that were part of the original structure of the building. Of course, if we talk about water, and we talk about an Islamic context, the baths, in this case the royal baths, the hammam of the city palace, are also an extraordinary example of that constant dealing with the water, that it's part of the Islamic culture. And the reception halls, combining water and, in this case, ponds and garden as an introduction to those reception rooms, are also extraordinary. Extraordinary as this one, that's the Palace of Comares, one of the different palaces that were put together along these 2 centuries in the city palace, that when you look from the outside, looks like a tower of a fortress. The whole Alhambra looks like a fortress from the outside. But when you go into those spaces, in this case the Tower of Comares, you have the most exquisite Palatine display of luxury, splendor, decoration, nothing that is connected with something that would look military, etc., with all the austere background that we assume it will have. They're really palace towers. That's what they are. Actually, there's a term that comes from Arabic, the calahorra, we say in Spanish. That's a palace tower. A tower that's actually a palace. And also a belvedere, a place to look, have beautiful views from the distance. The probably best well-known space of all the Mosque of Córdoba, of all the Alhambra of Granada, is in the Lion's Palace, the Lion's Court, named after this fountain that's in the middle of the courtyard, that it's held, it's supported by a series of 14th century statues of lions. In one of the chambers surrounding it, you have the dos hermanas, the 2 sisters. You have one of the most extraordinary displays, again, one of the most characteristic features of Arabic architectural decorations, the muqarnas, those elements that look more or less like stalactites and that are part of the development of geometrical decoration. That's such an inner part of the knowledge, the culture, and the art of Islam. On the other side of this same courtyard, you have the Lion's Hall, and again with this type of stalactite decoration. But what makes it even more interesting is the vaults, the painted vaults that in some of the rooms to the right-hand side. There we have the display, presentation of the royal court and the noblemen surrounding probably the Sultan that made this that created this palace, Muhammad V, here surrounded by his noblemen. But even more interesting are the 2 walls that are flanking it. And what you see there is a whole display of subjects that are taken from chivalry literature, but not from Islamic chivalry literature, but from Christian contemporary chivalry literature. As the painters that did it, they were 14th century, late 14th century, they were trained in the dominant style of painting of the time that came from Italy, the influence of Giotto, Simone Martini, Duccio, etc. Some of the features that are included are not only totally Christian, they're totally Italian, as you can see, for example, in the ladies there, totally European-like looking, in a building with a loggia and a campanile as the Gothic Italian structures of that same time. On the other side, you can see a duel between a Muslim warrior and a Christian one, and at the top also one of those the South traditional legends that are in stories of chivalry, that are the savage taming the lion. Now, when did this interest beyond Spain for the Spanish Islamic medieval history and art and culture really happened?
largely in the 19th century. At the time of Romanticism, when what for Europeans, Americans also, when the interest for the, let's say, exotic cultures, the cultures that were alien to the Western traditional Christian European culture, was very interesting, attractive. It's when the great travelers go to the East, to Asia, China, Japan, India, etc., Northern Africa, the Near East. Well, they found that, well, right there in Southern Europe, across the Strait of Gibraltar, but still in Europe, you had one of those exotic worlds. And travelers, writers, painters, engravers started, well, writing, painting, producing art that will actually remind, in their own countries, these interesting, well, artworks that existed in southern Spain from the medieval Islamic period. And you have all the examples you have of represent depictions of Seville, of Cordoba with the mosque, of the Alhambra of Granada, by artists from all Europe. Also for writers, and I will refer in a minute to one of those writers, in this case an American writer that has something to do with these artworks that are going to appear beyond Spain in this 19th and 20th centuries. Most of the cases, the influence of this admiration towards Spanish Islamic architecture was concentrated in these major monuments, the most famous, the most popular, the Alhambra of Granada, the Mosque of Cordoba, or the Giralda itself in Sevilla. Sometimes just a direct sole inspiration of one of the monuments. Sometimes a combination, a blending of different elements taken from one and the other. Following the first example, we have, for example, what was built in 1854 in Sydenham, close to London, but it's a suburb of London. That is, well, it was called the Alhambra in the Crystal Palace. It was the Alhambra courtyard because it was a direct copy of the Alhambra. As a matter of fact, the person that designed it, Owen Jones, had been in Spain, and some of the best engravings that were done at that time, in the mid-19th century, of the Alhambra of Granada, belonged to this person, to Owen Jones. Well, he decided, of course, he couldn't omit the existence of a Fountain of the Lions. Well, the Fountain of the Lions, and you will see that reappears in many monuments that have been inspired or loosely inspired on the Alhambra of Granada. But keeping ourselves in England and in something that has to do with important buildings connected with that Islamic influence, it is particularly interesting both for the name, the Alhambra Theatre, and because of its design both outside and inside, very Moorish, a combination that doesn't imitate exactly the Alhambra or any other part, but it's obviously the inspiration of Islam, and that was built in the... Actually, it was, the building existed previously, but it was finally turned into a theatre and redecorated in 1858. Finally, it was demolished in 1936. I think it was fruit of a fire that deteriorated the building a lot. And you can see some of the illustrations there where all those Islamic flavor elements are blended all together, both in the outside and in the inside. It was located in Leicester Square, you know, right in the middle of the city. Well, some of these inspirations that have had an effect on some spaces in architecture alien to Spain and the Islamic world and the medieval times have been fortunate enough, and with the quality of this Alhambra Theatre of London. Some haven't. And in this village, the Shima Spain village, that's an amusement park created in Japan with Spanish references all, well, mixed up together. There you have the cafeteria, that is the Mosque of Cordova, what actually is kind of surrealistic up to a certain extent. But there it is. It's, you can't deny that whoever decided, I don't know the name of the designer or the architect, but probably it's easy to find, well, was definitely following step by step the design of the archways of Cordova. Now, you expect that most of these Spanish Islamic influence buildings, as I say, in many cases, a blending of different elements from different medieval Spanish buildings, will appear in places that would be connected with Spain in a certain way. Many of them in the Americas, in the Hispanic Americas, in the Hispanic countries, such as this beautiful facade of the Ursulina's Palace in Havana, designed by José Toralla in 1913. And for this one, the National Society of Fine Arts in Santiago de Chile, again, with this Alhambra courtyard with its Fountain of the Lions in the middle. You see, if you check, you will see that practically all the dates we are of these buildings are from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. That was really the moment of the impact and the flourishing of this influence. In San Juan de Puerto Rico, La Casa de España, the Spanish house also there at the entrance. It's the only feature that actually imitates something from Islamic medieval Spain, but the Fountain of the Lions, of course, that's all over. Another country that you will expect also to have that influence is Portugal, due to its neighborhood with Spain. And yes, it has. Here, the Palace of da Bolsa, commercial center of exchange in Porto, in Portugal, has a lot of its rooms, particularly this one, with all that Islamic-inspired Spanish decoration. Sometimes you are surprised because you go to more distant places, as this Spanish synagogue in Prague in the Czech Republic. The only reason why it's called a Spanish synagogue is that it looked pretty Spanish, the building. It didn't have anything to do with a Jewish, Spanish, Sephardic community at all. But being where we are, I was especially interested, not just because I was here in Suwannee this time, it's something that has always appealed to me, and I'd like to get into it and know more and find more, are those influences present in the United States. And there are quite a number of them. In many cases, they are a combination of all these, let's say, different elements taken from different buildings, different sources, etc. Such as this, and serving to all kinds of purposes. Buildings with all the kinds of different uses you can imagine, as this Memorial Park in Compton, California, whose entrance looks very much like inspired, partly in a facade and partly in a minaret from Córdoba, Sevilla, and the inside more like into the Alhambra, for example. Or this Scottish Rite Temple in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that is quite incredible because all the features are imitating basically elements from the Alhambra of Granada, but finally it has that New Mexican touch, the color, etc., etc. So it's again a bit surrealistic, but in this case I think pretty appealing. In many cases, what actually is present more than anything else of that, let's say, Islamic inspiration may not be that much the decorations itself or the architectural elements, but the names. And for example, there are so many, there have been so many Alhambra theaters, cinemas, etc., all over the world, and definitely in the United States. One of the most famous was this one in El Paso, in Texas, but you have one that's not far from here, and actually it's working. In Hopkinsville, Kentucky, you have the Alhambra Theater. The only thing that it has from the Alhambra is the name. But in any case, it shows how, well, the inspiration, the idea, the influence is there. And one of the places I do think it's particularly interesting and that for different reasons that I will be telling you in a minute, is this town that's in the valley of San Gabriel in California called Alhambra. Now, this was the personal project of a man called Benjamin Davis Wilson. He was a Tennessee native from Wilson County, who was a trapper, traded in furs, and at a certain point of his life he decided to go west. Actually, apparently, his target was traveling to China. But I don't know exactly why he got stuck in California. But he did have a very, very, very successful life. He married the daughter of an important tenant in California. He was able to build, to buy an important ranch, and he held quite a number of official jobs. He was the representative for Indian Affairs for a long time, and as a matter of fact, he was so nice, and he dealt so well with the native Indians of the territory that they called him, in the Spanish term, Don Benito. At a certain point, when he was going to name part of this huge territory he owned, he followed the advice or the suggestion of his younger daughter, who was called Ruth. Now, her daughter was reading one of the most best well-known collection of tales inspired by the Alhambra of Granada, the Tales of the Alhambra by Washington Irving, the American writer that actually lived in the Alhambra of Granada, inside the Alhambra of Granada in the 19th century, where the Alhambra was no longer a palace and was hired as an apartment, with apartments, something like that. And as Ruth was, his daughter was, of Wilson, was actually reading this book, he suggested, she was fascinated by the tales of Washington Irving, she suggested his father to call that property Alhambra. That's where the name comes from. As a matter of fact, Benjamin Davis Wilson was the second elected mayor of LA. Just to complete the story, her daughter Ruth, the one that suggested the name, was later on, of course, the mother of the great Second World War General Patton. So, history is so intricate that you have incredible connections. Looking for some connection, you find something totally different, but also quite fascinating. This is what's happened to me when I deepen in the story of this man. And sometimes you find projects that are, well, pretty strange, and you don't really know why it came to the minds of those that created those projects. As this one, the American Institute of Mathematics in Morgan Hill, California, the final design for it was made in 2014, 2 years ago. I don't know if it has been ever built. I've been trying to find out, but apparently it hasn't. What makes a little sense, because what is this absolute, total reconstruction of the Alhambra of Granada be doing as a center for the study of maths? I don't really and in these extravaganzas, we can include Hacienda La Paz in Rolling Hills, California. That was the great mansion for a multimillionaire that came from Eastern Europe. And that was designed by Rafael Manzano Martos. Now, Rafael Manzano Martos is particularly interesting as a personality because he was the director of one of the greatest Islamic connected monuments in Spain, of the Royal Alcázares, the royal palaces in Seville, part of it Islamic and part later on. and of the great archaeological site of Madinat al-Tahara, the great city palace in the outskirts of Cordoba, built by the caliphs of Cordoba in the 10th century. That's just an archaeological ruin. He is, because he's still alive, he is a very good connoisseur, of course, therefore, of all that has to do with Islamic medieval Spanish art and architecture, and he created the design for this individual that is, well, a total extravaganza. It includes whatever you can imagine of, in general, of Islamic Moorish inspiration in a huge mansion. At a certain point, I was reading about it. I read the price of how much money it had costed, but I forgot because I think it included too many zeros, and I just couldn't really deal with it. But of course, if you talk about the United States, well, lots of things happen in New York. It always happen in New York. And there you have, for example, just as some examples, the famous Cornelius Vanderbilt mansion. It was from the grandson of the great Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder, the Commodore, founder of Vanderbilt University. And there, amongst other parts inspired from other art periods, he has the smoking room that is, as you can see, it had the smoking room that is totally Islamic Spanish inspiration. You have the central synagogue in the Upper East Side. It's very clearly the facade also is the same kind of inspiration. Yeah, your city center. That more extravagant, but in any case, both outside and inside, you have that very same Islamic Spanish decoration and architectural elements. Even in the Metropolitan Museum, when a few years ago they refurbished or renovated a part of the Islamic art galleries, they included what they call the Moroccan court. It's not because of being too nationalistic, but it's absolutely Spanish 14th century, imitating the Alhambra. Even the details of the decoration, as you can see down here, are exactly from the Alhambra of Granada, or the capitals there are exactly the Nashrid 14th century, 15th century capitals of the Kingdom of Granada. And finally, I always felt that to close the circle, we had to go back to the beginning. And if we go back to the beginning and we focus again in the Giralda of Sevilla and its twin tower in Kansas City, well, we can realize that it's probably the building, the sole unique building that has had a more direct, constant, and frequent impact in the designs of towers, in this case, in the United States of America. And that's a selection.
Wow.
Okay? It's loosely inspired, as you can see, but you recognize always, as you know, the Giralda of Sevilla, you recognize always Giraldas behind all these buildings in the United States, from Chicago to Minneapolis to a couple of them at least in Miami, a couple of them also in San Francisco. Some of them disappeared, such as the San Francisco Pan Pacific Expo or the Buffalo Electric Tower. I put two images of the Buffalo Electric Tower. One of them, that one, it's better to be seen there, but I love this one with all the electricity on. And this is just a selection. There are several of them. There are quite a number of them. The most important, the most famous, the best architecturally speaking, was the one designed by McKean, Mead and White in 1889 for the old Madison Square Garden. Actually, the design was responsibility of Sanford White, basically. This is it. It was unfortunately demolished in 1925, again for a weird story, and non-pavement of mortars.
Oh.
And actually, after being demolished, the whole Madison Square Garden was not demolished, only the tower. It actually brought up an issue about the preservation of historical buildings, that they couldn't be destroyed just for such economic plain reasons. Now, as I say, it was probably from the point of view of the quality of the architecture, the best of all these examples, and historically one of the most important. And it's also kind of one of those buildings that has its own history connected with the architect that designed it. Sanford White was actually assassinated in the rooftop. That was a restaurant at the top of the Madison Square Garden, actually by a jealous husband. The story is that the statue that crowns the tower, that doesn't represent the statue of the faith as the original Giralda in Sevilla, but it's a naked figure of hunting Diana, the mythological goddess, was, well, the sitter was the lover of Sanford White and the wife of the guy that killed him. Facing all these examples, numerous, there are many more, of Islamic art influence in the United States, a few days ago I started wondering and thought that there should be something connected with Islamic medieval Spain in Suwannee. So I started looking. More and more. I even, well, dared to go into private houses, smuggling at night. And finally I found it.
Oh my.
There you are. Directly, a ceramic, a wall covered with ceramic tiles that are absolutely 100% the same that exist, obviously modern in this case, in the Alhambra of Granada. So even Suwannee has its Islamic medieval Spanish reference.
Wow.
Thank you very much.